On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Sharma. He is the founder of Eppo. We're going to be talking about the relationship between data and engineering teams. Jay has some interesting background in terms of how that relationship works, how it evolves, and he has some interesting stories to share. Jay, thanks for being on the podcast.
Happy to be here, Amir.
Awesome. So let's start at the top and find out what Eppo does. And as a founder, what are your responsibilities?
Yeah, absolutely. Eppo is a next generation A/B experimentation platform. It's one that indexes heavily on metrics, analytics, and empowering engineers to kind of impact metrics. A lot of this comes out of my own personal biography, building this stuff at Airbnb. I think we, by investing heavily in experimentation, ended up with this incredibly entrepreneurial culture where engineers can, test stuff out. They're given free rein to see how good their ideas are. And, we saw just incredible impact from just ideas that would come from any part of the org. So I often say, we're really in the business of selling entrepreneurial culture. And, the best way to get there is A/B experimentation.
Absolutely. And then you're a founder, but maybe you could help us understand, kind of what roles you play.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is in data science, and originally I studied electrical engineering and stats. So I kind of, going down this kind of technical data work side, I did production machine learning and a lot of data engineering, data tools development. So I say that I'll say I mostly came from the technical side, but since starting Eppo as a solo founder, I find myself, first I was doing technical work, then I started really focusing on product strategy and go to market, which I still do today. Although as the org grows, suddenly you're really in charge of vision and finding the right people to accomplish that vision.
Absolutely. Different hats, but it's all still towards the goal of growing the company, obviously. And this episode kind of is centered around, talking about the relationship between, the data team and the engineering team. And I think a couple areas we're going to be touching on are some of the components of that balance and how they actually partner. But maybe just at a high level, just to start off in terms of, just what that relationship between data and engineering looks like. When you're kind of, in the past, obviously you played a little bit more on the data science side. How do you kind of view the different types of personalities that sit maybe on the data science team versus the engineering team?
Yeah, data science is pretty interesting because, there's forms of data science that are very into building. You think of production data systems, and then there are also parts of data science that are about evangelism, about kind of swaying decision-making. One of the ways I like to think about this stuff is that every single product iteration has 4 cycles. It has understanding the problem, designing a solution, building the solution, and then measuring if it works. And when you think of that framing, data science tends to, especially the evangelism side, really focuses on understanding the problem at the beginning and measuring it at the end. And in between is where a lot of engineers sit, which is around designing the solution and building the solution. So there's kind of a nice partnership that can kind of develop there where data people are really trying to improve decision quality across the org. And the most important decision quality is usually product decision quality of just are we launching the right things? And engineers are uniquely situated to make product happen. And some of it comes through, a top-down product planning process, but engineers also in the best organizations have agency to do what they think is important. So, the way I think this partnership works is that data teams need to scalably give everyone an understanding of the problem. And that's not just the head of product, but literally every engineer should truly understand, who are the customers? What do they want? How are these systems performing? And then, engineers can take that and build amazing products.
Absolutely. And I guess, that's an interesting distinction because obviously decision quality, engineers are building things, they're building things in real time. They're putting it out there, getting deployed. There's a little bit of a lag, no matter how close we want to be. There is a little bit of a lag to decision quality metrics. I guess when you're looking at the relationship and obviously they're producing things and the data team's coming back with those metrics after the fact, how does that tend to balance? How does that tend to work?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what stage of organization you are, right? Because like to understand whether something worked or not, you first need metrics. Like, what is success? How do we decide something is successful or not? Is it usage? Is it transactions or something like that? And that's really where I think a lot of data teams need focus, is actually providing a value system for the organization of just saying like what is good and what is bad. Because once you have that basic understanding, it's really empowering for engineers to say like, look, I know that for Airbnb in 2014, we were focused on growth. We care about the number of bookings. We don't care about revenue. We care about the number of bookings. I, as someone who's like living in the product so much more than pretty much anyone else in the organization, because I'm constantly developing it, I can just see these opportunities, right? And I can go out there and build it. Now, earlier in an organization's history, like it can be a little bit of a long feedback cycle, both out of the data volumes and traffic you get, and also out of like a lot of times the data person has to manually pull this stuff, and that's kind of painful. And so the other responsibility of the data team is to not just establish a virtuous cycle of, what is successful and what's not, but to make that virtuous cycle go really, really fast. And, as you might imagine, a system like Eppo with experimentation, that's really where we see ourselves.
Absolutely. And I guess when you're kind of looking at, some of the feedback loop, obviously, you're looking at some of that A/B, testing some of that experimentation, coming back with engineering. Sometimes you're going through a product team, sometimes you're not, like you said, depending on the stage. So maybe let's talk about, the different stages of, an organization, smaller teams, bigger teams, and how that relationship plays out. You mentioned Airbnb. I know, some obviously we'll put your LinkedIn profile into the show notes. People can go look at your background, but you work there. Drawing from like that experience, how were some of those experiments launched, especially if the feedback loop's important and it takes some time? Are there cases where it diverged and the engineers went off and did something on their own and hoped they were right, or how did that potentially play out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was there for 5 years as context. I was there from 2012, 2017. I was the fourth data scientist. So when I first started, there was just a lot of low hanging fruit, and it was a pretty small org. And by the time I left, it was a behemoth, right? There was a lot going on. And over those 5 years, some of our strongest experiments, the things that move the metrics most powerfully, were things that kind of came out of an engineer's head. And so the classic case I always bring up is, the most impactful experiment of that entire 5 years was this engineer made it so that when you click on an Airbnb listing, it opens it in a new tab. So little change, right? But the design team and the product team, they were like, it feels kind of ugly or whatever. But the engineer who did this was like, look, if I go to a bunch of other similar sites, they adopted this pattern. Why don't we just see? And lo and behold, it was a huge deal, because it turns out not losing your search context and not having to backspace all this time was a big deal for getting people to actually book things. So that's just an example where it's like the biggest changes can come from, the biggest metric movements can come from small changes, and engineers are just uniquely enabled to like push the boundaries and like take away all these sort of sacred cows of like what do we know, what do we not know.
Yeah, that's actually, I think we talked about that, and I think that's a super interesting functionality that I don't know how I would live without, because I'm so used to it. And I was thinking about it, I was like, what would I do if I would lose that search context? And you see some sites that do, and you're like, well, could you make it like Airbnb? Anyways.
Another example I always like to bring up is, another one of our most impactful experiments was the Airbnb team at one point decided they wanted to build these neighborhood guides, these things where you're going to go search and say, I want to stay in the Mission District of San Francisco. And then you go and you'd have these pages of like glossy photos and like, here's where you can go to this nice bakery and here's this park, whatever. It was a big investment. There's all this press, it was like a big product launch. It turns out that one of the top 5 most impactful experiments was to get that entire flow out of the product, just remove it. Because reading pages and pages of glossy photos and text was a huge distraction from booking Airbnb listings. And it turns out we are not TripAdvisor. We are like a booking platform. And that sort of thing is, from an engineering perspective, is really interesting because it shows that you'd think there might be this feeling of like, wow, I wasted a lot of time, getting all of this code right, getting all this logic right, doing this debugging, like there's just so much time spent on making code. And then it's like, oh wow, that whole thing was a waste, like a negative thing, right? And you'd think that would be a big detriment. But what I've noticed is that engineers love knowing that we are doing our best to not waste time. Like, it's just that feeling of like, our organization is keeping ourselves honest of like, what is a waste of time, what is not. And I'm glad to have that feedback cycle, because like, even if this thing turns out wasn't a good use of time, like we have confidence we're going to set up Converge on it. Plus I can try out my own ideas and see how hard this stuff is.
Yeah, I guess, that's an interesting point. And I guess if I'm thinking through what you said, obviously engineers like to see things into use, into production. I think you always hear one of the complaints of why engineers leave organizations. Well, I'm building stuff that doesn't ever get used. I mean,
yeah,
how fun is that? And I guess when you look at the experimentation side and you're looking at, the data science, the product team, they're responsible for, getting the experiment set up, qualifying them, making sure that these are the right experiments that should move into production. That's a lot of trust on the engineering side. Like, I mean, you have to have a good process. You have to have it defined. Because if you get it wrong a few times, they might be like, hey, okay. But if you get it wrong more than a few times, obviously there's other problems, but then you lose confidence and, the engineers might lose confidence as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we've noticed with these experimentation maturity curves is when you first start measuring things, here's a data point as context. Like, it is abundantly clear that the industry's standard success rate of product launches is around 20 or 30%. And there have been all these papers coming out of Airbnb and Netflix and Google and Microsoft and LinkedIn and Yahoo and Facebook. Everywhere you look, it's around 20 or 30% of the things that you think are improving metrics are actually improving metrics. So which is crazy to think about, talk about, wasted time. But it turns out it's just hard to know what's actually going to improve metric or not. And once you first start running experiments, you immediately start to see this success rate. And it's kind of a psychological moment for the org where it's like, wow, like we just put out 4 things, only one thing worked. Like, are we the problem? And then you quickly realize it's like, no, that is the standard. And what you need to do is just try to get up from like 20% to 40% or whatever, right? Try to and the way you do that is just the starting point for that is to just know what worked and what didn't. Like, if you don't even have that basic knowledge of what worked and what didn't, you're never gonna get there.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think you mentioned obviously small percentage of functional impact in terms of that percentage change, and you sometimes see I think when you see Gmail make a change, you have a lot of opinions, and I guess now that I'm thinking about it, I wonder how many times an engineer might be coding something wondering, well, I wish we could do this, and bring that feedback loop back into the experiment, and their views of obviously the implementation sometimes is more tangible versus here's an idea that we think we tested that could actually work.
Completely. And, there are ways to kind of avoid wasting time a little bit by saying like, look, it's maybe you have to spend like twice as much effort to build it both on Android and iOS. Why don't we just put it on iOS first and run an experiment and just get some data, right? So then when we go to build on the other systems, we can, at least get some of those learnings in. Like, experimentation kind of opens up the path for a little bit more like of a feedback loop mid-development, which again, prevents you from wasting time.
Absolutely. I guess when you're looking, at your own organization, you run your own team, you have experience balancing this relationship with the engineering team. You've seen engineers bring, some successful ideas to the table and successful experiments. How does that change how you view that dynamic within your organization? Because obviously you've seen it.
Yeah, a big thing, I think, and I touched on it a little bit earlier, is that as the company grows, I really feel like the purpose of leadership is to define the strategy. Like, what are we trying to accomplish at this exact moment? And ideally, how can I convey it in metrics? But I'm also one of those people who believes like, if a qualitative statement is actually the closest thing to defining it, you should stick with that. But ideally, metrics. And so is it that you're trying to increase margins and revenue, or are you trying to increase growth? Or do you have like a strategic play to like position yourself and acquire these types of users or something? Whatever it is, these are the questions leadership has to provide to the team, because otherwise you're going to end up with all this froth of like, well, this sounds good and this sounds good, and all for different reasons. Like we need some basic prioritization mechanism to work against. And that's true both for the product org, but then also with this sort of kind of virtuous feedback cycle.
Absolutely. I guess the one question that comes up for me is, as you're shifting from, let's say you're a smaller org and you're becoming bigger, and you start seeing shifts from, sales driven experiments to now, actually have a product team that's responsible to partner. How does that relationship start changing? Because obviously experiments would sometimes just dotted line into production, and engineer would just build it. Now there's an extra step. They it's going to go through a different team. They're going to look at it. They're going to vet it, make sure they have tighter metrics before it goes forward. How does that relationship start evolving as you shift from that sales to product driven type of org?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing that changes is early on in a company's life cycle, you have so much customer intimacy. Like every single person in the building has probably spoken to 10 different customers, like longitudinally, like multiple instances. That's the part of the joy of working at a startup, is that you just have these like very deep connections with your customers. But kind of as you grow into these growth stages, like you kind of lose that. Like if you think of the average employee of like a Series C startup, you probably might talk to like 2 or 3 customers your entire time there. It's like and that's just kind of the nature of things, where like early on, this heavy amount of customer intimacy lets you kind of like, operate a little bit more on intuition. And then eventually you have to gravitate to this world. They're going to operate off data, because data ultimately is the voice of the customers. It's customers voting with their feet, right? And so like that's kind of where these data teams start cropping up. That's kind of right around this product market fit time, where you're like, let's bring on the first person. We'll have them start off with just like BI dashboards. But the arc of this work is to arm everyone with this kind of direct line to customer feedback via data. The analogy that I think YC uses all the time is like, early on when you're a startup, you're kind of like a Wright brothers plane. And like, it's like this simple little thing, but you have like perfect visibility. You can look all around and see the sky and the earth, like in every direction. And by the time you're at product market fit, you're kind of like a 747. In which case you can't just look around and steer. You have all these dials and stuff that's saying like, how high up are you? And, what do you need to do? And that's kind of the change that needs to happen. So I think of data teams, the analytics sides of data teams, really what they're trying to do is provide that early stage customer intimacy at scale. And as you might imagine, experimentation is a very large part of that. Absolutely.
I guess now that you're kind of envisioning your own company, and kind of the growth and the dynamics that you've seen work elsewhere, as you start moving you guys from being sales driven to product driven, do you foresee yourself trying to formalize that faster, knowing that eventually it's going to happen in a more rigid process, and a better product org might help?
Yeah, definitely. I think, experimentation and entrepreneurialism is really in our ethos. It's why we exist, right? So as you might imagine, we put a lot more premium on it. And the way I think about it is that, like, what is experimentation? It's sort of like trying to have a scientific, falsifiable approach to the product. And you can do that even early on, right? Like even early on, you can say like, if we build this, we expect to see this. And if we don't see this, then we have to start asking some questions. And so, maybe like early on, it is not like a literal product experiment. Maybe it's something where like we want to see some real customer love, like vocally on our calls or on social media or something. Like, we should see some real sense that people are like using this thing and loving it. I really think that like, it's funny because a lot of early stage founders have been running experiments the entire time. They just don't call them experiments. They just do that. And so like, that's really kind of how I think about this thing. And so we're formalizing the scientific process early on, and it'll just kind of have more and more rigor as we have the data volume to do it.
Absolutely. I guess kind of thinking through your own progression. Obviously, you'd like to formalize it. You wear different hats. I always think this is an interesting question because you wear different hats right now. You probably maintain, because of your background, a pretty good anchor within that data science, experimentation area as well, as you mentioned. When do you start giving up some of those hats and like, hey, I've got to shed some of these? I mean, it seems like it's one of the hardest things for a founder to be cognizant of when they need to divest themselves of responsibility, but also if they don't, that becomes a bottleneck.
It really is. And one of my favorite books for this is it's this book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And I think this is really important for everyone's career. Like even if you're not a founder, even if you're just kind of, getting promoted at various points or taking on projects at different points, it's just really important to realize that the reason you got to where you are was due to a bunch of actions, which are not going to be the things that get you to the next level. And that's just so true of being a founder. And except that kind of outgrowing, like the thing that got you there won't get you there, that just happens so fast. Like on the scale of seemingly months, if your company is growing fast like ours. And so I think one of the big transitions is early on, you can kind of operate like a sprint team. You can be really in the loop on a lot of stuff. And then kind of quickly you have to start acting a bit more like an org where like you have to foster leaders. You have to kind of create a framework for fast decision making. Because one of the things about being a startup is that it's usually not necessarily the quality of your decisions, is how fast you make them, how to fit into being fast you make them. And so like what you can't have is a situation where like people in the company don't feel empowered to make decisions, and they feel like they have to go through the CEO. And as CEO, there's always this feeling like, man, if I get involved, like I'm sure I could eke another 20% more, output or something like that. But you just got to resist that thing and just empower your people and, let them feel true ownership and agency over, what they're operating on.
I think that's some great advice, because I think that's how you get a really strong team around you, because you're going to need that if you're going to scale. So I think your perspective is, I think, awesome. I was going to say, Che, thanks for being on. I know you're super busy, taking time out to be on the show. Can't thank you enough. I was going to ask you, we've been asking guests, I'd love to see if you have a question or topic that you'd hope a future guest could respond to.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think a lot around is how do you build great engineering culture? Right. This is something that I take, we had such a great engineering culture at Airbnb, and I've just kind of been obsessed with it ever since. One that values craftsmanship and has a great, build cool stuff energy to it. Like, everyone just has a lot of pride, even in the down moments when you're like, have a bad week of bugs and you're all in the trenches together. Like, how do you build this culture where people are energized to work together? And, I have like all sorts of my own personal answers to that. And I'm very proud of what we built. But I just feel like it's this question that is both so important, but like doesn't get direct on the nose conversation as much as it needs to.
Absolutely. That's a great topic. And hopefully somebody out there listening to it who has gone through the process of building an org, or has experience building out an org with unique culture, a great culture. I guess those are some subjective words, but it's more art than science. And I think it'd be great to share.
And one of the things that I have learned already is that like the people who are asking the most around like what makes a great culture, like it's not the people who haven't figured it out who are asking that. The people who have figured it out are still asking that. Like there's a true depth of the conversation, and you just have to treat the topic seriously enough that you're going to continue improving at it.
Absolutely. Well, I was going to ask you, if somebody does want to reach out to you to pick your brain on anything you've mentioned, if they want to, they're like, heck, Eppo sounds like a great company, I want to go work for them. If they just want to chat with you about anything you've mentioned on the episode at all, what's a good way of getting a hold of you? Is it LinkedIn, email? What are some good options?
Yeah, LinkedIn, Twitter, email. My email is che@geteppo.com. I always love hearing from people. Our website is geteppo.com. You can reach out to us there. I'm on LinkedIn. Chetan Sharma is my full name. I'm sure you can kind of provide a few links in the notes.
I'll get them out there.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from people. I'm very, very passionate about this subject, and kind of how do you unleash this sense of ownership and agency and entrepreneurialism in companies.
Absolutely. I can't thank you enough. I appreciate your time, and thanks for being on as a guest.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amir.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again. Different guest, different topic. two things. One, if you can speak to the art, I'd like to say, call it the art of building a great engineering culture, reach out. I think to Chay's point, I think a lot of people love to hear more about that, and I think we can't have enough people talking about it because it's definitely takes some skill and know-how, and let's share that with everyone. And secondly, if you find the episode useful, please share it. That's how it's been growing. I can't thank everyone that does every week. That's it for this week. I'll be back again. Thank you and goodbye.